From the hound of distributism, a solution for our social and economic crisis. The moral philosophy behind most modern experiments means one of two things. Either the theory that a centralized plan can be so perfect that we need never criticize the action of the center, or else that some one idea, such as centralization, can be pushed further and further forever. G.K. Chesterton. Understanding Subsidiarity by David W. Cooley. While distributism primarily focuses on the economic question, it is founded on a philosophical view that addresses all aspects of society. Indeed, the conflicts between distributism, capitalism, and socialism ultimately stem from the different philosophies that underlie each of them and the different views each of those philosophies has regarding the nature and structure of society. Each, of course, considers the positions of the others to be false views. Therefore, each has the responsibility of presenting and defending its view, as well as exposing why the opposing views are unacceptable. When discussing the structures of society, distributists use the term subsidiarity to articulate what has been clearly established in the social patrimony of the Catholic Church. Subsidiarity is characterized by the stipulation that, quote, a community of a higher order should not interfere in the internal life of a community of a lower order, depriving the latter of its functions, unquote. Rather, the higher echelons of order, quote, should support it in case of need and help to coordinate its activity with the activities of the rest of the society and should be directed with a view of the common good, end quote. I'm pretty sure that quote might be from Pope Leo XIII. This definition, however, while sufficient for explaining the essence of subsidiarity, fails to explain why people should accept the idea of subsidiarity. Neither is this definition of subsidiarity complete, as the conditions upon which the lower order may not usurp the higher are left unclear. Finally, we cannot simply offer this definition to societies that have long been trained to accept a different view. The answer to these questions is important because it establishes the intent and purpose of the various levels of society. Once we understand why different levels of society exist and which levels are the most basic ones on which all others depend, we can build our foundation for determining their proper authority and powers by virtue of their existence. Capitalism is founded on a view that the most basic unit of society is the individual. Capitalists do not claim their system can operate with a man who lives in isolation. Indeed, the adherents of capitalism would readily admit capitalism cannot function without society. Otherwise, to whom would the individual sell? However, can the individual be the most basic level of society? Society is the sum of relationships. Therefore, the individual cannot be the most basic level of society, because the individual cannot by himself be considered a relationship and therefore constitute a society. In fact, if humanity were reduced to one person, society would soon cease to exist. Society may be constituted of individuals, but no individual can constitute a society by himself. Socialism proper is founded on a view that the most basic level of society is the state. Socialists understand that other levels of society must already exist in order for the state to exist, but their view is that as each higher level is established, that higher level takes primacy over the lower levels, reducing the lower levels to virtually complete subjugation. However, the idea of the most basic level of society is not merely that level which currently exercises the greatest power, but that level which is fundamental to the very idea of society. It is unarguable that other levels of society must already exist before the state can exist. Therefore, even if we were to concede that its establishment grants it complete primacy over the lower levels, the state cannot be considered as the most basic level of society. Fair enough. Distributism holds that the most basic level of society is the family. The family is a form of human relationship and is therefore a society in and of itself. It fulfills the needs for humanity's continued existence. The family is also the level of society on which all other levels depend for their existence. Various associations and groups come into existence when members of families work together or have common interests and concerns. They can help address common things that are beyond the ability of a family on its own. Community exists when several families live near each other and have a need for the establishment and enforcement of laws. Higher levels of government come into being when there is a need to address concerns beyond the ability of the community, like the defense of region or state and so forth. But the family can exist even if marginally without depending on any other of these levels. Therefore, the family must be the most basic level of society, with the other levels existing to fulfill the needs of families living in community, that is, as larger orders organized in higher levels of society. Another important aspect of these views is how each perceives power within society. This can be seen in the various arguments made about the role of government, what it should or should not do, and why it should or should not do it. Capitalists frequently complain about government interference in free enterprise and how largesse government should be reduced to almost nothing. Socialists, on the other hand, argue that government should strictly regulate businesses and individuals through legislation and taxes. Both are based on erroneous philosophies and goals. The capitalist philosophy embraces individuals as the source of power within society. It is derived from the view that the power of government is determined by the consent of the governed. Most capitalists agree that government must have certain powers by its nature. Disagreements within the capitalist camp over the extent of that power abound, but they all agree the power of government is derived from the will of the people. The authority of government extends only as far as the individuals, either collectively or by majority vote, agree. The philosophy that underscores socialism is that, by virtue of its establishment, the state becomes the source of power within society. All socialists agree that individuals and groups have rights, but these are derived from society as a whole, and the state gets to define what those rights are. Even when the majority of the people believe certain things, those who tend to the socialist view look to different levels of the government to establish what rights exist and should be enforced. This view, like that of the capitalist, represents a very fundamental difference in the ordering of society. To properly respond to this, we must ask ourselves why the state exists. Since humanity can, albeit imperfectly, live in relationships without the state, why do we establish states? In order for the state to be the most basic level of society, it would seem that it would need to be the first level of society established. As humanity can, albeit imperfectly, live in relationships without the state, the existence of the state is dependent on other levels of society that come into some sort of conflict. Therefore, the most basic level of society cannot be the state. Distributism measures the authority of each level of society on the needs that level exists to fulfill. When considering which level of society has the authority to address a given need, distributists ask what is the lowest level of society capable of sufficiently addressing that need. When needs can be addressed by lower levels of society, it is an abuse of power for a higher level to usurp that role. Thus, for the state or even the city to usurp the family's authority over the education of its children by enforcing what must be taught, or by establishing difficulties or restrictions on religious education. For the city to establish zoning laws that force economic burdens, like the need to commute, on its citizens. For the state to establish regulations or economic policies that give advantage to large corporations over small community-based businesses. For the state or federal government to impose its views on how health care should be managed. all constitute examples of a higher level of society unjustly depriving the lower level of its rightful authority. As higher levels exist to meet that which cannot be sufficiently met by the lower, and as systematic problems require systematic solutions, the central authority is to exercise its power when needs of society as a whole cannot be determined or fragmented by the discernment of smaller authorities. The regulation of imports, drugs, or legislation against severe crimes or human trafficking, for instance. Thus, subsidiarity is conditional and measured by competence, while also an active agent in favor of the lower levels of society. The important feature of subsidiarity is that authority is neither granted from below, i.e. the people, or above, the state, but from outside. The establishment of a given level of society bestows upon it the level of authority appropriate to its nature, according to the moral and natural law which comes from God. This is the essence of subsidiarity. Higher levels of society exist to fulfill those needs and functions that cannot be met by the lower levels. However, a higher level must not usurp the functions of a lower level. The scope of authority decreases as the level of government increases. However, the authority of each level of government is not derived or granted from the lower level. It is inherent to itself by virtue of its existence in accordance with the moral and natural law. Another important feature of subsidiarity is that it includes the idea of solidarity, that the society as a whole has a responsibility for all its members. Thus, when we say that higher levels must not usurp the authority of the lower levels, we also say that the higher levels must support lower levels in cases of need and help coordinate activities with a view to the common good. To understand this, we must understand how to distinguish at what level of society a need should truly be met. We must avoid the temptation to think that just because a problem is widespread, it must naturally be within the jurisdictions of a higher level of society. Take, for example, the problem of tending to the needs of the poor. If only one community had the problem, then we would naturally say that the families, churches, social organizations, and possibly even the community government would have the primary duty of tending to their needs. However, the fact that poor exist throughout the state has been used as justification for the state to take over tending to their needs. This constitutes an unjust usurpation of authority and a disordering of society. Just as we would expect neighboring communities to assist when needed, the role of the state is merely to assist the lower levels as they tend to that responsibility. On the other hand, if we look at the case of rioting and looting, this is naturally the responsibility of the local community, and while it would be commendable for citizens to step forward to assist the community authorities in dealing with this situation, it would be wrong for bands of citizens to act as vigilantes. Both capitalism and socialism contain some good points, but because the philosophies on which they are founded are ultimately based on a false view of the fundamental form of society and how authority within a society is derived, they ultimately fail to provide true justice. Distributism seeks to establish an economic and social order that is based on justice and the natural law. Subsidiarity as the basis for the social order establishes the greatest protections for family and individual rights. By keeping authority as local as possible, the citizens maintain the most direct control over laws and regulations that impact their everyday lives, and they are more empowered to make necessary changes when power is abused. Because subsidiarity does not neglect the communal responsibility for all citizens, and it also acknowledges when certain issues are properly the responsibility of higher levels of society, a distributed society is still capable of addressing widespread problems without usurping the authority of the lower levels. This view represents a true philosophical shift from those that are prevalent in our societies today. That was by David W. Cooley. Originally from Southern California, David W. Cooley lives with his wife and 2 children in Washington State, where he works as a network administrator.